All right, welcome back to Chapter 9. We are going to pick up talking about individualism, which we touched on just briefly in that last lecture, but we're on page 162 in the text, and we commented in the last lecture that employees are individuals and different from each other, so there's no single correct way of dealing with all of them. And so if you start at the text on 162, it says, "We are all unique. Countless factors and influences in your upbringing, background, education, and life experience make you the unique person you are. Because of our differences, we relate to the world in our own particular ways. Individual experiences are never identical, and our uniqueness affects our ability to communicate with each other. Whenever we communicate with others, we're attempting to describe what has happened within us as a result of experiences coming from outside of us. As long as each of us can sense with only our own minds, the process will remain imperfect. We have no control over the mind of another. Rather than directly transferring a thought or feeling, the best we can do is put it into words and hope those words create a similar thought or feeling in someone else." Now, so dropping down, kind of going to get into communication and a personal approach here. But developing mutual understanding. Every supervisor should strive to develop a personal approach to establishing and maintaining honest, two-way communication in all person-to-person contacts. A sound approach does not involve slogans, catchphrases, or other special language or unique terminology that has to be learned. It involves only common sense rules and suggestions. There's no formulaic approaches. Rather, our interest most appropriately resides in the simple fundamentals of good interpersonal communication that, when fully absorbed through faithful practice, essentially become automatic. Now, to sustain an effective communications posture, and we're over on page 63 in that last paragraph above, controlling your communication channels. Starting over, to sustain an effective communications posture, we need to continually go more than halfway. This means no more 50-50. We need to go more than halfway, more than half of the time, without expecting our efforts to be fully reciprocated. Now you're thinking, what the heck does that mean? So we have to abandon the so-called 50-50 ethic, where we seem to believe that it is only fair for each of us to go exactly halfway and meet in the middle. There is something in our makeup that can cause us to feel that we are being taken advantage of if we perform more than half of a joint task more than half of the time. However, we need to do exactly that. To make this posture more palatable, consider doing so will improve your communication, and the primary beneficiary of your improved communication is always you. So, what are our formal communication channels? So, as a supervisor, you have 6 formal organizational communication channels. You have communication to and from your direct reporting employees. You have communication to and from your immediate supervisor, and communication to and from your peers and other horizontally positioned organizational elements. So these constitute your 6 channels, 3 incoming and 3 outgoing. All right, so let's talk about a one-way versus a two-way street. Going down to a genuine two-way street. Problems can occur when there is no interchange between participants in the transmission of a message. That is, if feedback is not a part of the normal communication process. Without verification or acknowledgement, there is never assurance that the message sent and the message received are the same. Employees always need to have their concerns addressed and their questions acknowledged, even when management has nothing substantive to give them. So, too many supervisors tend to remain silent when they have no substantive information to impart, but silence is upsetting and potentially harmful. Employees need to be talked with even if all the supervisor can say is that nothing is yet known for sure. So dropping down, comparing and contrasting one-way versus two-way communication relative to some key characteristics. So let's talk about speed. It's always quicker to just give information out in a one-way fashion and move on than it is to invite or supply feedback and develop mutual assurance. So one way is definitely quicker. I can spout off the information I need to give and walk away. Takes a lot longer if I stand there, welcome feedback, ask for comments, ask about if there's any questions. And so under the pressure of time, we are encouraged to communicate one way when we should be consciously communicating two ways. All right, noise. Two ways always noisier. Noise in communication, interference, or generally unwanted transmission is always present in two-way communication. We must accept its presence and learn how to control it. It exists in the form of external distractions and as extraneous, confusing, and conflicting information that flows when multiple parties are involved in communication. And then correctness or accuracy is always greater in two-way communication. In so-called one-way communication, there's no verification of information. Two-way communication, however, is predicated on achieving interchange that reduces or eliminates the likelihood of error. So if I say something to you and you repeat it back to me in your own words and I say, yes, that's correct, then there's likely not going to be any errors because we both know what I said. I said it, you understood it. Now, if I say something and you don't understand, but you don't ask for feedback, you don't ask if you heard me correctly, then you may go off and do something that I didn't actually mean. All right, now let's talk about the last one, sender. In true two-way communication, the sender's position is one of vulnerability. Because the sender of a message can be questioned or challenged in a two-way situation, some senders tend to adopt a one-way posture that effectively blocks out feedback. Further problems of the sender's position are the difficulties created by poor management and inept leadership. Managers who are driven largely by ego, arrogance, impatience, or aggressiveness are more inclined to communicate one way, acting on the implicit assumption that because they understand what they're saying, then everyone should understand them. Certain leadership styles encourage feedback, and certain styles block feedback. All right, so let's talk about time. We're going to kind of go over here to... I lost it. I just saw it, but I lost it. So we're going to go to section what true two-way communication requires. We're going to start there. So trust and respect must be inherent in the process, and all participants must either want the same thing from the process or must generally have a common purpose in communicating. Parties must be willing to give as well as take, and must be willing to allow their ideas to be challenged, and must be willing to change if necessary. There should be nothing to fear from this process. A sound idea will only be strengthened by challenge. And if an idea be thrown into doubt by challenge, it should probably be examined further. The process requires a certain humility that allows one to place all participants on equal footing and holds no one's thoughts, ideas, position, etc. beneath your own, even though you may be the highest present in terms of the organizational hierarchy. Now, none of that had anything to do with time, so anyway, just disregard that. Let's move on to barriers of effective communication. All right, so let's talk about semantics. Words, our most actively used tools of communication, are in truth quite inadequate for the role we expect them to play. We expect far too much of these small bits of language. A word is simply a symbol we use to stand for something. It is not the thing itself. The only true meanings words have are the meanings we give them through active use. Words are also likely to mean different things to different people. For instance, how long or short a span of time does prompt mean to you? Some words can even mean different things to the same person at different times or under different circumstances. For example, the word fix may mean one thing to you, if you happen to be repairing an automobile, and something else entirely if your immediate interest is locating a reference point for navigation purposes. We have words in our language that can be described only as fuzzy in terms of meaning and usage. Take a good look at a few of the words that fill our organizational communication, sometimes to the point of overflowing. Again, we have prompt. We also have sufficient, appropriate, adequate. What do those terms mean to you? Do they mean the same thing to the person sitting to your right? Do they mean something different to the person sitting to your left? Emotion. Words often carry emotional overtones that vary from person to person and create additional barriers to interpersonal communication. Words that register neutrally or perhaps favorably on some people are likely to hit sore spots in other people. Aside from the obvious, profanity, obscenity, ethnic slurs, and downright insults, many words used without malicious intent will trigger negative emotional responses in listeners. Perhaps the word stubborn does not bother you, but the person you're talking to may resent being referred to as stubborn. Perhaps your boss places a favorable connotation on the term eager beaver and applies this to you. However, you may resent the term as suggesting you're trying too hard or bordering on being annoying. You might prefer to be called loyal and energetic. So no matter how inoffensive you try to keep your language, you will sometimes touch one of those sore spots and trigger an emotional reaction. Dropping down. Positive emotions can be good to some extent in interpersonal communication. However, even positive emotions such as joy or enthusiasm can cloud individual judgment and impair communication when they're experienced to a degree that the feelings themselves become more important than the message being communicated. The negative emotions, hurt and anger and all of their variations, definitely tend to impair effective communication. Generally, the higher the negative emotional level of one or two parties, one or both parties to an interpersonal exchange, the lower are the chances of meaningful communication. When emotion threatens to turn a discussion into an argument, it is time to back away from the situation as diplomatically as possible and try again when tempers have abated. Alright, so then we have personal barriers, which could be attitudes, biases, etc. Alright, so we're going to stay right about here. Alright, so personal barriers. As individuals, we all have limitations that function as barriers to effective communication. We have the tendency to generalize. Concerning most things in life, sooner or later, we have to generalize to be able to take part in life and to communicate at all. However, when we generalize based on limited information or on a single case or example, see one and you've seen them all, we limit our communication effectiveness. Even generalizing at all means erecting barriers because our generalizations always exclude some information. We also tend to categorize or pigeonhole by putting people or things into a limited number of compartments. Rarely are there only a pair of alternatives, as in there are two sides to every issue. Usually there are a number of possibilities and sometimes a large supply of options. In a practical sense, however, we cannot recognize an infinite number of pigeonholes. The best we can do is remain open to all reasonable possibilities. Alright, so let's talk about effective listening. How much of the talking do you do in any interchange with an employee? This is a valid question because you cannot truly listen while you are talking. Of our four verbal means of communication, writing, reading, speaking, and listening, when effectively practiced, requires most of our communication effort. Yet, listening is the single communication skill for which the least amount of solid, practical help is available. Writing, reading, and speaking are all active processes. To engage in any of these, it's necessary to decide to do so and take the appropriate action. Too often, however, listening is treated as passive. One can hear without conscious effort, but without the deliberate application of honest effort, true listening cannot occur. So, I like this statement on our slide. How come it takes 2 years to learn to talk and 60 or 70 to learn to be quiet? So, let's talk about effective listening. How do we do this? Number 1, we be attentive. We deliberately concentrate on what the other person is saying. Do not turn off the speaker as uninteresting or forgo close attention to the subject because you know it already. Some people speak in ways that fail to grab and hold your attention automatically. And if you're really to listen to what is being said, then you will find it necessary to apply some conscious effort. Number 2, wait before responding. All but trained listeners are likely to rush their responses by reacting to only a portion of what is being said. The temptation is great. You hear a few words that trigger a response, and your mind races ahead and forms the comment you want to deliver as soon as they pause. Resist this temptation. While your mind is busy forming your response, your listening capacity is reduced, sometimes to the point to where you will interrupt the other person because you just can't stand being quiet. Instead, deal with one complete thought or idea at a time, hearing the person out completely before offering a response. Number 3, get the whole message. Most people have a habit of listening only for facts. Facts are useful, but their usefulness is diminished if they're not considered within the context of the entire message. Listen to the whole message before making decisions and rendering judgments. Number 4, keep interruptions to a minimum. If you can possibly avoid doing so, try not to interrupt the other person to offer a correction or something you think has been improperly stated. Certainly avoid interrupting to offer advice or to scold or otherwise criticize. This is especially important in face-to-face communication within the supervisor-employee relationship. Generally, interruptions are in order only if you make them to ask for expansion or clarification of something that has been said, or to ask related questions intended to encourage more relative comments. Number 5, be aware of your emotional sore spots. While you are listening, be aware of the possibility of emotional reactions within you. As noted earlier, it is possible that the other person will unintentionally trigger an emotional reaction. Give the other person the benefit of the doubt and force yourself to concentrate on the message as being distinctly separate from its emotional overtones. You cannot help what you feel, but you can control what you do with those feelings. All right, diversity and communication. Not going to really go into this section, but I will comment on the slide. Healthcare supervisors are managing increasingly diverse work groups, so communication requires an understanding of differences between and among cultures. Now, the one diversity that I can tell you about in my time as a manager was different age groups. You know, I had some employees that were in their 60s, had some employees that were in their 20s. And the way we would communicate with each other was completely different. You know, usually the older crowd wanted to call me and talk to me if they were going to miss work or be late for work. My younger crowd, they would text.